Beneath the streets of Mexico City lie dormant gods. They sleep, losing their shape and form once provided by humanity's devotion, their graves covered by the idols of foreign deities. Entombed, they wait, crystallized in time as ruthless, wrathful, hungry for blood. Once, long ago, they were revered and loved by millions. Massive temples, effigies, once entrenched in color and life, dedicated only to them, now waste away under an immense municipality built on their desecrated bones. They linger, awaiting the day when their disciples return, the day when their temples and patron colors can once again fill the landscape. In time, they shall return. History has a nasty habit. It likes to take cultures, people, massive achievements of humanity's greatness, and bury them. It's nothing personal, because this omnipresent entity is a slave to our ambitions and interpretations, our lies, and our actions. What we take as truth, no matter how marred and conjecture may be, is often not inspected, as long as enough of our society has accepted it. It is said that history is written by the victors, and while true, this school of thought is what leads to the defilement and misconstruction of those who lived before us. Indeed, history is written by the victors, but it should really be instead understood that history is written by the writers. The buried gods under the streets of Mexico City are at the mercy of those who write our histories, as they are the destroyers of the truth that they perpetuate. This is how history buries a culture.
Hi, I'm Caucasian, and I'm sorry. I know I'm probably going to get a lot of flack for this video, but I really don't care. While I normally talk about sort of miscellaneous topics on this channel, my main interest historically has for a long time been indigenous Mesoamerican cultures, particularly the Aztec. I am 100% aware that the Aztec called themselves Mexica, but for the sake of streamlining this video and avoiding confusion, I will refer to them mainly as Aztec. The situation surrounding the Aztec and their culture, especially today, is fascinating and intensely frustrating for a few reasons. Here's an example. Have you guys seen this upcoming Aztec video game? If you haven't, I'll show you. It's called Ecumene Aztec, described as a, quote, brutal stealth game set during the Spanish conquest, and when I first heard about this, I was pretty pumped. I'd been waiting for a game about Aztec or Mayan culture to come out for quite a while, because it's an insanely underrepresented part of history and has some massive potential. Can you imagine the next God of War game being set with Aztec mythology? Oh my god. You can probably understand my disappointment when I watched the trailer and saw it looked like this. PS3 animations, bland colors, and various historical inaccuracies, especially here where the character is running through the city. Where's the color? Where's the life? It also portrays the conquistadors as these horrifying and intimidating figures with flintlock pistols at that, which they wouldn't have had. Okay, I'm not going to spend forever on that trailer because if I don't stop myself, I totally will. But what this trailer accentuates to me is a couple things. The lack of historical accuracy is just indicative of how Aztec and indigenous Mesoamerican history is treated and is frankly really disrespectful. I didn't get super mad or rage baited, I guess, until I looked in the comments of the Instagram post. While I won't show specific comments, a good chunk of them and most engaged with were saying what you'd expect them to say. I'd rather play as the good guys. Will I be able to eat a baby in this? Why would I want to play as these disgusting monster cannibals? Among many others. I'm paraphrasing those, but you get the idea. This is one of the most interesting parts of contemporary views of Aztec culture to me. Even after 500 years, people still continue to absolutely hate these people, unlike any other culture. While some cultures and people are hated and looked down upon, the treatment of the Aztec is unique. People still treat this culture like they were the bad guys, nothing but barbarous monsters who deserve to be destroyed under the righteous boot of Christianity. While completely ignoring that, to put it plainly, they don't exist anymore. Obviously, Aztec descendants still exist, there's pretty much a whole country of them, but they don't exist as a culture like they did in 1519. Alright, I'm going to stop you right there. Before I get any farther into this, I'd like to say that I, hopefully, obviously, do not support what the Aztecs did. Here's the thing though, I don't hate them. In my opinion, which is always right in case you forgot, it is foolish to detest and waste energy hating ancient extinct cultures. It's unproductive and only perpetuates contemporary hate. You can smell this argument coming from a mile away. It's very distinct, kind of like BO. I bet you someone is typing right now that, well, if you think it's dumb to hate the Aztec people, then you must not hate Nazis. My answer to that argument I just made up in my head is that, for one, I do hate Nazis and fascism because those ideologies and practices still exist and are to this day an ever-present threat. And two, pre-Columbian Aztec and Mayan culture doesn't exist like it once did. Obviously, again, it still absolutely does. I just had a corn tortilla earlier, but in terms of the parts that people detest the most and still hold over them, human sacrifice, cannibalism, and many others, those just don't exist anymore, so I have no reason to hate them. If Mexicans and Salvadorians and Guatemalans were still today taking prisoners of war to the top of pyramids and cutting out their hearts to feed the sun, then yeah, I'd be against it, because that's wrong. But through a historical lens, it simply does nobody any good to waste energy detesting them anymore. Did you get your likes on Instagram? Good for you. Now go take a shower. You stink. There, that's my argument. Take that shampoo bottle that I totally just bested in this imaginary fight. Okay, so what I'm getting at here with my super dramatic intro and complaining is that the whole point of this video is to analyze one of the most interesting events in human history, one steeped in myth, lies, mystery, and a whole lot of 16th century political bullshit, and how it has been changed and interpreted. I hope you like those things as much as I do, because this took me a while. These people are despised, unlike so many others, for actions that, in terms of comparison to what other cultures did in the past, are really not that crazy. Now, I will say that if you're looking for a video refuting historical myths, this isn't it. I'll probably do that at some point, but what I'm going to analyze here is how the conquest of Mexico narrative has been changed and viewed through time, and how it bears example of how we naturally change history as humans. Whether we like it or not, the history of the Aztec is viewed and will always be viewed through a colonial lens, and through their wars with the Spanish. In this video, we're going to look at how that happened, why, and how it makes us confront our innate human habit of burying history. Before we do that, however, I'd like to recommend a couple books that can help you better understand indigenous Mesoamerican culture and history, but more reliably. While we aren't discussing that directly, it is important to know. So first, a pretty basic one. The Aztec, a very short introduction by David Carrasco. While a little outdated, it still provides you with all the information you need to get started here and is a very easy read. Second, Fifth Son by Camilla Townsend. This is more recent, being published in 2020, and what's unique about this book is that it tells the Aztec story through their perspective, using newly translated Nahua sources, while being open about biases and utilizing archaeological research to back up or dispute claims. It's pretty great. Third, The Outward Path, The Wisdom of the Aztecs by Sebastian Purcell. This one is most recent, releasing in August of this year, that being 2025 for all those watching in the post-American Republic hellscape in 2168. This book is among the first to dissect the philosophical teachings and practices of the Aztec culture. It may not be apparent at first, but the Aztecs were a very philosophical people. While this one isn't required, I still recommend it. And lastly, The Conquest of Mexico, 500 Years of Reinventions by various authors, which will be one of the larger sources for this video. For the case of the Aztecs, I recommend reading scholarly sources and books more than watching videos. Have you guys looked at the YouTube recommendations if you search up Aztec religious practices? So much AI and other crap. I mean, Jesus Christ. Anyways, enough with the dilly-dallying. Let's get into the incredible culture the Spanish came across and how they and history buried it. We are Charlie Kirk. This is my 4th time recording this. On November 8th, 1519, an army of Spanish conquistadors and their indigenous allies entered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, where the captain of the expedition, Hernan or Hernando Cortez, met the Aztec Huitlahtawani, or Great Speaker, Montezuma Xoyoquitzin. We now colloquially refer to him as Montezuma because I guess European language speakers couldn't really figure that one out. Making their way across one of the many massive causeways that connected the island city in Lake Texcoco to the mainland, The army entered through the city's gates. The Spanish were presented with the Tlatoani, who sat upon a mat of reeds under a canopy covered in beautifully green kesselbird feathers. He wore sandals decorated with gold and jewels. The emperor's servants swept the ground in front of him as he stepped off his platform to greet the visitors. Here he would explain to Cortez that he was handing over his massive empire to him, as he and his army represented the prophesied return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Montezuma, like other indigenous leaders like that of the Inca, gave his empire to the Spanish under the foolish assumption that they were gods, influenced by his primitive religious beliefs. Lying is pretty fun, isn't it? Most of you have likely heard that story, as it's the most propagated version, and for God's sake, it's currently engraved in the sandstone walls on the inside of the American Capitol Rotunda. A good chunk of that story I just told isn't true, except for Montezuma's pimp sandals. I'd never lie about that. Do me a favor. Just take a second, pause this, go for a walk, whatever, and just think about that fable for a second. Think about how the most powerful emperor in the two massive American continents just gave up his incredibly expansive empire to only a couple hundred, more specifically one Spaniard, because of some prophecies saying that he, Cortez, was a god. Have you thought about it? Probably not. Nobody listens to me anyways, but that's fine. If you did, it probably wouldn't take you long to decipher that that story makes absolutely zero sense even on a surface level. I don't think any person that has ever existed who wasn't suffering from serious mental deficiencies would do something like that, unless Cortez was some snatched goth baddie in fishnets. Then I bet a few of you would, because you're weak. In order to comprehend the larger topic of this video, we need to dig deeper into a few things. We need to analyze the Spanish conquest of the Aztec, the writers of its history, and the implications created, as well as how those narratives have been changed, interpreted, and used. This video started as banter in my head. I've grown up in a very privileged position compared to others. I have a supportive family who does well monetarily. I've never had to worry about when my next meal will be. Things have always been decently stable for me. Obviously, I've gone through trials and tribulations like we all have, but I'm lucky to have resources at my disposal to assist me through those difficult times. What I'm getting at here in my flexing is that I've never had to worry about life like others do. I live in a nice place with good weather, with a roof over my head. I get to go to university and better myself, and because of this, I've had the opportunity to spend far less time worrying about my life and situation, and through my interest in history, I've taken it upon myself to better understand groups and peoples who have been historically subjugated and wronged, and those who continue to be. Hi again. I'm a virtue-signaling straight white male, and I'm so sorry. In this privilege, I've had the chance to have and spread empathy among others who are comparatively privileged, and I hope in the future to teach history, preferably about Indigenous Americans. And in my growing interest in oppressed peoples, I have naturally gravitated toward certain subjects, particularly Indigenous Americans, their history, and their cultures. Being in my societal position as a straight white man has also added to this, because it was my people hailing from Europe, like my ancestors, who were the main contributors to the collapse of indigenous societies all over the world, and setting up our modern global atmosphere to prefer and aid people like me simply for being born this way. Side note, Cam, I'm not telling you to hate white people or that you should feel bad for living on rightful indigenous land before any of you say that, because I know there will be a couple of comments getting mad at me for that. I'm not pushing for guilt for being born in the position you've been born in if you are white, especially in the United States. I'm saying that acknowledgement of your position and of the historical and factual oppression of these cultures on their ancestral land is good practice, and it's kind of the least we can do. Nobody is forcing you to give up your land to an indigenous group, although I wouldn't be opposed to that personally. Just remember and acknowledge that you live on stolen indigenous land. I apologize for telling you how white I am, but I thought that I should mention it. I've always had an odd fear that people will get angry with me for talking about Indigenous Americans as someone whose ancestors were colonizers. So I thought that being open about my personal position would help that, so that you see I'm not coming at this in a self-righteous stance like so many white people do when they're talking about indigenous cultures. We tend to treat them like they're just novelties of the past, when these people are still very, very real and still a very high population and deserve to be treated and respected like the rest of us. My main focus for a while now has been Mesoamerican cultures, particularly the Aztec, like I said. Their cultural subjugation provides a great example for how people and societies can be demonized historically. Also, they were just so insanely metal and beautiful, and I love it. And on my time researching the Aztec, I have found the experience to be considerably different from my time looking into other cultures. In order to be a proper effective historian, you need to practice skepticism, cultural relativism, and neutrality. You can get a decent explanation of this in my video, Columbian Conundrum, but if you don't feel like it because you're a dumb nerd, then here you go. Skepticism is the most obvious of the three. History is not written by the victors, it's written by the writers. And the main goal is not to find the perfect unbiased source, it is to find the source that is most open about their bias, or a source where their bias is easily inferred, so you can work around that. Cultural relativism is a practice where one's actions and beliefs are understood to be influenced by their own culture and shouldn't be judged by the standards set by another's culture. Basically, as long as someone's cultural beliefs and practices aren't harming other people, you really shouldn't care. Stay in your lane. And neutrality plays into cultural relativism, but also the study of history in general. Reading historical sources, it is insanely easy, natural even, to let your bias show through. There's nothing wrong with that, it is simply impossible to view history impartially, but we should all try our best to view historical events impartially and by gathering as much cultural, personal, and societal context as possible for better understanding. And again, go watch my other video if you want a better explanation of that. I'm not gonna lie, it's a banger. Back to my experience researching the Aztec, what I have found is considerable difficulty trusting sources. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec, which was completed with the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, is one of the most, if not the most, important post-15th century event in human history. Generally, when massively influential events occur, World War I and II, fall of the Roman Empire, American Revolution, among others, there is a large amount of sources, both primary and secondary, describing and detailing the events as they occur. But the incredibly aggravating and frustrating thing about the Spanish conquest is that there are basically no sources detailing what occurred, and that's for a few reasons. For one, the conquest was insanely isolated from established European settlements in the Americas, and especially isolated from Europe. Two, it was also relatively quick compared to other wars at the time. From the time the Spanish entered the Aztec capital to its fall, only 2 years had gone by. The expedition into central Mexico was actually illegal. Cortez only had authorization from the Cuban governor Diego Velázquez to scout the coast around eastern Mexico and set up a small settlement on the coast. He was then to go back to Cuba, but instead he set up the port town of Villarica de la Veracruz and appointed some of his generals to run the town, thus fulfilling his contractual obligation, and then he began his legal and unauthorized expedition into Mexico to find a massive empire that the Spanish had heard so much about in their first 2 scouting and trading missions to the coast of the Yucatan. Because of the illegality of his expedition, time was of the essence, and events transpired very fast. The illegality of his self-appointed mission will have a big role later on. Another big factor in the lack of sources was the systematic destruction of indigenous sources on this conquest, as well as the massive suppression of Spanish primary sources back in Europe for centuries. And because of this, there were only a few sources that have been used to discuss the conquest. This fact has been disastrous in the long term. So who are our main scoundrels? Hernan Cortez, Spanish captain in the war, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in the war who wrote his account decades later, and Bernardino Sahagún and his many native partners, who were instrumental in telling the indigenous perspective, although their work wouldn't surface until far later, not even that long ago. So for over 500 years, the writings of Cortez and his letters to the King of Spain and Del Castillo have been the main players in how we write about, understand, and interpret this massive historical event. So pretty much all we have had reliably for half a millennium is the accounts of 2 Spaniards, and like you can guess, they are very biased. The same can be said about the work of Sahagún in the Florentine Codex. The Codex is an incredible work, written by Nahua individuals a generation removed from the events of the conquest in their indigenous language of Nahuatl in the Latin alphabet, which was then translated by Sahagún into Spanish. It also includes a massive amount of Nahua-style illustrations, and this codex details the intricacies of the Nahua, and thus Aztec, history, religion, and their perspective on the conquest. And this is an insanely important work, and is the most extensive account of the other side of the war, making it incredibly valuable. But it is, of course, full of bias, especially in the section detailing the war itself. Some portions written in Nahuatl that weren't perceived as favorable to the Spanish government were translated differently into Spanish, generally making them more tame. An example being where the Nahua writers wrote that the Spanish were greedy monkeys with a piggish hunger, which was then translated into basically they were happy when they got gold. Shout out DJ Peach Cobbler. Love that guy. This is the most important aspect of this discussion. When analyzing the conquest of the Aztec, we simply have to accept the fact that every source we have is biased, making some almost totally unreliable, while most should be taken with a handful of salt. Archaeological evidence has been instrumental in the past few decades in our understanding of the pre-Columbian Nahua life, but no matter what we do, these events will always remain a murky cloud and we will always be getting things wrong, just like the rest of history. The conquest of Mexico and the fall of the Aztec Empire holds a unique place in history. Not often are events so mysterious and manipulated, bent out of shape, that we pretty much have no idea what happened, aside from a few European sources and one larger native source. As we will discuss, that is the intention of the conquest, but I'll get more into that in just a second. But you should know that Aztec history and culture is viewed and will always be viewed, like I said, through a colonial lens, and via the events of the Spanish conquest of the empire. As much as I would like to spend time refuting the myths in the narrative from the evidence we have, that would make this video way longer than it needs to be, and it's already this long. Not sure how long when I write this, but I'm sure it's really stupidly long. The script is longer than my last video. What we need to understand is how the narrative of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire has been interpreted and changed over time, and an understanding of which will allow us to dig through the murky depths of the political 16th century and 18th century bullshit and firmly grasp what really possibly happened. It seems to be in the nature of an event of such importance with such lack of accounts to become so murky. Like I said, we will always be getting things wrong about anything in history, and that can be expected in any historical analysis, which is honestly really upsetting. It's impossible to obtain an objective and unbiased source and to perfectly describe historical events. But for now, all we can do is remain critical and work with what we have. Sorry to be such a negative Nancy. I spend a lot of my mental time thinking about how much we will never know, which is probably why I'm consistently really tired, but such is life. I'll probably be replaced by an AI soon anyways. You better not make me do anything freaky. I know you're dying to see me with like rock hard washboard abs. It must be a zesty festa. Martin Luther King, LeBron James twerk off. Zesty festies. You're blocked.
Let me block you for disrespecting Dr. King.
What do you do? So, where do we go from here? My favorite hobby, personally, is to attempt to dissect all these historical knots and garble and get really overwhelmed because it is so much. Well, before we get into some of the aspects of how the conquest itself has been changed over time, let's change how we think about certain things. The most valuable tool you have in your brain arsenal to understand this insanely complicated event in history is your ability to reconsider and be open-minded. He's cleaning himself. This explanation is brought to you by this book, The Conquest of Mexico, 500 Years of Reinventions, which I highly suggest for further explanation on this video's topic. More specifically, the preface by Matthew Restall, who you might know from DJ Peach Cobbler's Fall of the Aztec series, of which his research played a large part in crafting. This book is like an all-star team, Avengers-level collaboration of a ton of esteemed and experienced historians of Latin American and indigenous Mexican history, so I'd say it's pretty reliable. Restall begins by saying that the Spanish conquest of the Aztec is a time loop. In order to understand the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, we have to entirely change how we talk about it. Firstly, let's change the name. Instead of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, which has a Eurocentric focus, let's call it the Spanish-Aztec War of 1519 to 1521. I know that's boring, but whatever. You may be thinking, what's the point of that? Aren't they kind of the same? I will agree it is a little boring, but not exactly. Restall, professor of history and anthropology and director of Latin American studies at Penn State University, in his time loop analogy points out a unique perspective. Restall points out how the conquest was not some singular event. In modern literature and academics, most understand the conquest of the Aztecs to have taken place from 1519, when the Spanish forces entered Tenochtitlan, to 1521, when the capital fell. But that doesn't exactly fit the definition of a conquest, at least in the colonial sense. If you look up the definition of conquer, you will right away be presented with overcome and take control of a place or people by use of military force. That's a Google definition. The Cambridge Dictionary version says to take control or possession of foreign land or a group of people by force. K-Cat. The Google definition simply says conquering is to take control through military force. The Cambridge definition says the same thing but only mentions force. I feel like that doesn't exactly apply to the conquest of Mexico. Could we say that the force of mostly Tlaxcaltecan troops alongside other native warriors and the small group of Spanish conquistadors did, in fact, conquer Tenochtitlan? That is fair, although it is important to acknowledge the role that a smallpox epidemic played in the whittling of the Aztec population in the city post-Noche Triste, pre-return of invaders when the city fell. Calling this event the, quote, conquest of Mexico is not accurate, yet the 2-year event is referred to as the conquest of Mexico, instead of the Spanish-Aztec War. Restall has this to say, quote, the conquest did not happen just once, it happened repeatedly on different planes of time, space, medium, and interpretation, and continues to happen. The quincentennial for which this book was released does not simply mark events that occurred in Mexico 5 centuries ago. It commemorates the replication, reiteration, and reimagination of those events across 5 centuries. So what we're looking at here is political propaganda. 500-year-old propaganda from the Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España by one of our main subjects, Bernal Díaz del Castillo. This book has been the main source for historians and academics when discussing the Spanish-Aztec War. Castillo was an officer and participant in the war, so this is a primary source. But here's the thing. It was written in 1568, 47 years after the end of the war. Castillo by this point was old, and he would die in 1584 at around the age of 94. They didn't exactly have the vitamins to keep your brain regular back then, so we can reasonably say this source is unreliable. The account is just drowning in political crap from the time and is seriously favorable towards Spain. It's unrealistic to talk down on him for this. The political system of Spain favored conquerors and those who brought glory to the kingdom. What the problem really is how uncritically we have looked at the Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España in the over 450 years since its publication. The title is really fun to say. Go to your local bookstore and find books on the Aztec and look in the hopefully present bibliography. A solid 90% of the time, the first or one of the main sources used will be the work of Castillo. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as he does provide seemingly accurate accounts of Aztec life for a decent part of the book. He spends a lot of time praising the incredible architecture and political sophistication of Tenochtitlan. Of course, that doesn't mean any of it is necessarily true, though. In reality, we as historians, yes, me, are in a sticky situation. Due to the aforementioned lack of sources, we have to consider Castillo's account, although very critically. It's like if your mom made you go hang out with the weird kid and you had no choice because he was the only other kid on the block. But overall, Castillo wrote propaganda that has been utilized by academics for centuries, since it's probably not all lies, but the obvious bias that it presents forces historians to spend large amounts of time picking it apart before using it. This account is also where the whole Montezuma thought Cortez was a god myth was first published, although it was originally mentioned in Cortez's letters to King Charles to protect his ass. Okay, I keep going off on tangents. I gotta write this shit. I'm talking so much about Castillo's work because it is a prime example of the true conquest of the Aztec. Accounts like that of Castillo have been integral to the burial of indigenous Mexican cultures and is also an example of what is known as a black legend. A black legend has historically been a political tool used to vilify certain people, generally to justify military action. Pretty much every single powerful nation ever has utilized a black legend. The US created one about Spain just before the beginning of the Spanish-American War, which focused on their genocidal actions against Native Americans. A primary method of doing this was the first ever mass publication of an account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. This book became insanely popular and did a great job at swaying American public opinion on Spain. This helped to justify the American instigated war against the Spanish. Spain had a black legend against the Aztec, justifying their invasion as an attempt to stop their practice of human sacrifice and cannibalism in an effort to liberate their subjects. If you have a brain and aren't a jellyfish, or jelly because it's not a fish, you can probably figure out that that is total garbage spewed by Cortez and Castillo to save their asses from punishment back in Spain. It probably wouldn't have even mattered since the war brought Spain an insane amount of money and territory. Cortez was actually prosecuted for his crimes, but posthumously. It didn't matter at the end of the day. Even the Aztec had a black legend created about their powerful neighbor in Azcapotzalco. When the Mexica and the Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco duo were up-and-comers, the most powerful Altepet, or independent city-state, was Azcapotzalco, due to their military prowess and patrilineal connections that set up nobles from their population to have power in many nearby city-states' hierarchies. The Mexica created a black legend about Azcapotzalco to convince nearby city-states to later parts of the Triple Alliance that was the Aztec Empire in Tlacopan or Acolhua and Texcoco or Tapaneca. This black legend created the atmosphere that allowed the Mexica and their allies to invade Azcapotzalco, which helped to make the Mexica and Tenochtitlan/Tlatelolco to the top of the political ladder. I'm just going to call it Tenochtitlan from now on. I can't keep saying that. Not only did Castillo's account of the Spanish-Aztec War create a story that rewarded him and others like Cortez, but it also created a black legend that painted the Aztec as monstrous, brutal, cannibalistic human sacrificers who also created an incredible empire with fascinating, beautiful culture and people, all propped up by a gorgeous and complicated political system and leader in Montezuma. It's a very hypocritical text with massive dichotomies that make it clear that Castillo had some respect for the Mexica, yet had to write about them in a negative way to justify he and Cortez's actions, and to create an image of himself that would reward him in the Spanish political system. Are you cleaning yourself? What do you have to say? Nothing. Castillo's account, being an integral part of the cultural conquest of the Aztec, popularized the image of the Aztec that has made them so hated and disrespected historically. Later publications like History of the Conquest of Mexico by William Prescott only added to this effect. I have a book here that's part of a series that discusses what most considered pagan folklore. I have one on Native American stories, North American stories, and Mesoamerican stories in history, where the section on the Aztec mythology is frankly just gross. Mind you, this was published in 2023, that is 2 years ago. So I'm going to read this really quick. I hope you're ready for this because this is about to knock your socks off. Starting on page 285. In contemplating the religious system of the Aztecs, one is struck with its apparent incongruity, as if some portion of it had emanated from a comparatively refined people, open to gentle influences, while the rest breathes a spirit of unmitigated ferocity. It naturally suggests the idea of two distinct sources, and authorizes the belief that the Aztecs had inherited from their predecessors a milder faith, on which was afterwards engrafted their own mythology. The latter soon became dominant and gave its dark coloring to the creeds of the conquered nations, which the Mexicans, like the ancient Romans, seem willingly to have incorporated into their own, until the same funereal superstition settled over the farthest borders of Anahuac. The Aztecs recognized the existence of a supreme creator and lord of the universe. They addressed him in their prayers as the God by whom we live, omnipresent, that knoweth all thoughts and giveth all gifts, without whom man is as nothing, invisible, incorporeal, one God, of perfect perfection and purity, under whose wings we find repose and a sure defense. Stop it. These sublime attributes infer no inadequate conception of the true God, but the idea of unity of a being with whom volition in action, who has no need of inferior ministers to execute his purposes, was too simple or too vast for their understandings, and they sought relief, as usual, in a plurality of deities, whom presided over the elements, the changes of the seasons, and the various occupations of man. Of these, there were 13 principal deities and more than 200 inferior, to each of whom some special day or appropriate festival was consecrated. At the head of all stood the terrible Huitzilopochtli, the Mexican Mars. although it is doing injustice to the heroic war god of antiquity to identify him with the sanguinary monster. This was the patron deity of the nation. His fantastic image was loaded with costly ornaments. His temples were the most stately and august of the public edifices, and his altars reeked with the blood of human hecatombs in every city of the empire. Disastrous indeed must have been the influence of such a superstition on the character of the people. The fuck is your problem, man? A far more interesting personage in their mythology was Quetzalcoatl, god of the air, a divinity who, during his residence on Earth, instructed the natives in the use of metals, in agriculture, and in the arts of government. He was one of those benefactors of their species, doubtless, who have been deified by the gratitude of posterity. Under him, the earth teemed with fruits and flowers without the pains of culture. An ear of Indian corn was as much as a single man could carry. The cotton, as it grew, took of its own accord the rich dyes of human art. The air was filled with intoxicating perfumes and the sweet melody of birds. In short, these were the halcyon days, which find a place in the mythic systems of so many nations in the Old World. It was the golden age of Anahuac. From some cause not explained, Quetzalcoatl incurred the wrath of one of the principal gods, and was compelled to abandon the country. It is explained, if you would read any of this. On his way, he stopped at the city of Cholula, where a temple was dedicated to his worship, the massy ruins of which still form one of the interesting relics of antiquity in Mexico. When he reached the shores of the Mexican Gulf, he took leave of his followers, promising that he and his descendants would revisit them hereafter, and then, entering his wizard skiff, made of serpent skins, embarked on the great ocean for the fabled land of Tlapalan. He was said to have been tall in stature, with white skin, long dark hair, and a flowing beard. Does this look like a white guy to you? No. The Mexicans look confidently to the return of the benevolent deity, and this remarkable tradition, deeply cherished in the hearts, prepared the way, as we shall see hereafter, for the future success of the Spaniards. We have not space for further details respecting the Mexican divinities, the attributes of many of whom were carefully defined, as they descended in regular gradation to the household gods, whose little images were to be found in the humblest dwelling. So, there's also another page back here that's just kind of racist towards a lot of people. Mythology may be regarded as the poetry of religion, or rather as the poetic development of the religious principle in a primitive age. It is the effort of untutored man to explain the mysteries of existence and the secret agencies by which the operations of nature are conducted. Although the growth of similar conditions of society, its character must vary with that of the rude tribes in which it originates, and the ferocious Goth, quaffing mead from the skulls of his slaughtered enemies, must have a very different mythology from that of the effeminate native of Hispaniola, loitering away his hours in idle pastimes under the shadow of his bananas. It's gonna get a fucking yikes from me, dog. You know who wrote that section that they took that from? The William H. Prescott that I mentioned earlier. And I'm drinking cranberry juice. Yay! It's so gross. But it's so good for me. Rude tribes in which it originates, and the ferocious Goth, quaffing mead from the skulls of his slaughtered enemies, which... But seriously, did the publishers even read that? Holy David Duke, that was racist. Not just toward the Aztec, but Caribbean natives too. Classic Eurocentric move to compare indigenous religions to European religions directly. What a joke. This is what I'm talking about. The accepted narrative of the Aztec is wholly represented by what I just read. Why have we not changed our minds? In this discussion of conquest as an ideological and cultural process, I believe it is important to evaluate an aspect of history and sources that makes finding legitimate answers so difficult. This idea was brought up in the essay collection mentioned earlier. Historical events, and the past in general, is a dynamic flowing entity. Instead of viewing history as a linear line of events or even a line that branches off in many directions from causality and such, we should think of it as a web of events, all interconnected in some way. Hell, we can even view history as a brain, with new neural connections being made. I'll get to the point. Every single time that any individual at any point in time has brought up a historical event, whether for an argument or even just casual discussion, that historical event is forever changed. In order to travel from the web of history to the sound waves made by someone's vocal cords, the event needs to pass through several filters. These filters change and manipulate the event through bias, as well as cultural and environmental contexts. These filters, for the better part, are not in place intentionally. It is in our nature to be subjective and manipulate discussions to better suit our situation, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Occasionally, it is used for more argumentative purposes, possibly to build something else up, and we'll see examples of that in a bit. Essentially, these events, after being manipulated by the filters of human consciousness and thought, are then transferred back to the web of history, forever changed. The consequences of these changes reverberate to the entire web of interconnected events. Every time any instance in history is mentioned, it is passed through the filters of bias and context, molded by them with layer upon layer of personal bias added, further altering the web of history again and again. This is how events become buried in the public consciousness. These changes are small and gradual, but they add up to something much greater. Let me give you an example through a quick story. It was spring when they landed at Veracruz. The local population, bewildered at the sudden appearance of foreigners bearing advanced weaponry, mostly fled, and the invaders' beachhead was quickly secured without a single life lost. Thus did their leader, a bold and discipled man, begin the conquest of Mexico, for which history was to remember him. The road from the coast to the great city of Mexico was arduous for the invaders and rife with enemies. Yet the brutally effective tactics of the determined conqueror and his men ensured that none could long obstruct their progress. Within months, his party crested the ring of mountains surrounding the ancient network of towns and lakes that was the bustling heart of Mexican civilization. According to his biographer, the leader of the expedition paused a moment between the snow-capped peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl and, quote, looked down, like an eagle from the cliffs, upon his prey below, but not without admiration of the beauty which surrounded his weaker adversary. But history had a plan. After months of bitter fighting, the conqueror defeated Mexico's last defenders and became its governor, ushering in a new era. To his biographer, this victory was not merely the result of tactical genius, it was also a triumph of civilization over backwardness, a victory that demonstrated the superior strength and energy imparted to a people both physically and morally, by their benevolent creed and style of government. Indeed, he argued, heaven itself had underwritten the conquest at every step. In this sense, the conqueror was more than just a vicious commander, he was an avatar of progress itself, the human means by which history had chosen to power its innate forward trajectory. What else could explain the incredible accomplishments in Mexico of this leader, so far from his homeland and so greatly outnumbered and surrounded by enemies? That was a pretty neat story about Cortez and his expedition, right? Well, actually, it's not about Cortez. This story is about General Winfield Scott during the Mexican-American War. Here's the story a little bit further. But, of course, the 1846 U.S. Army campaign of General Winfield Scott, described above, was not the first time foreigners had landed at Veracruz en route to capture Mexico City. Scott closely followed the paths that the Spaniard Hernando Cortez had taken 3 centuries earlier. Thus, did he intentionally produce a vivid instance of historical rhyming, the symbolism of which did not escape the contemporary biographer Edward Mansfield? Quote, thus, at the distance of more than 300 years, was renewed the landing and march of Cortez. Both were brilliant and remarkable in history and conduct. The Spanish hero came to encounter and subdue on unknown shores the Aztecic American civilization. The Anglo-American came to meet and prevail against the Spanish-Aztec combination. Both came with inferior numbers to illustrate the higher order and vastly superior energies of moral power. Both came controlled by an invisible spirit in carrying forward the drama of divine providence on earth. Doesn't that just go hard? Remember how I mentioned how occasionally a part of the history web can be used to build something up? This is a prime example of that. By manipulating the story of Winfield Scott making his way to Mexico City in this way, by telling the story as him following in the footsteps of this legendary Captain Cortez, he had created an image of epicness, of importance, superiority, and of historic significance. Painting the picture of the American general bringing civilization to a backwards land is quite clearly emulating and invoking the popular narrative around Cortez. By telling the story in basically the exact same way, it creates the sense that Scott, an American, and thus the United States, are the rightful predecessors of the great colonial empire that once controlled Mexico. This is an example of a macro-level historical retelling, while someone bringing up an event like the American Civil War, let's say, passing it through subjective filters is an example of a micro-level historical retelling. Macro level is the attempt to manipulate the true facts of a story to create a different effect, like what happened with the Winfield Scott story, which has more consequential and faster change to how an event is seen, while micro level is less consequential and much more gradual change made by individual people. The gradual change might be visible after long periods of time, but nonetheless, it will have an impact in some way. The historiography of the conquest of Mexico is smothered in historical retellings, the changes reinventing the real history several times, to the point where I don't believe the real history is even salvageable. We will always be missing something, which is true of all history, but particularly this history. To historians, the fundamental identity of this conquest of Mexico is its murkiness and ambiguity, which has made it profoundly difficult to discuss in scholarly circles. I believe it is really important to understand how the concept of the narrative of the conquest has changed and been utilized through time, as generally the entirety of Aztec history is seen through the lens of the Spanish-Aztec War. Make no mistake, this culture is lost. We will never have the privilege of fully understanding them as they were on the eve of European arrival. This video started in my head as an analysis of the misuse and reputation of Aztec culture and history, but as I spent a lot of time writing the script, it has morphed into more of a study of how history and narratives are created, used, and manipulated. Aztec history is just a great example of this, and I apologize for those of you who thought this would be a video largely debunking myths surrounding them. I can absolutely do that at some point, just let me know. But for now, I really suggest checking out DJ Peach Cobbler's 3-part series on the fall of the Aztec. It's definitely worth your time. Did that make any sense? I have no clue. I'm hoping that at least gave you some groundwork for the rest of this video. I feel that it's important to understand that in order to even discuss the Spanish-Aztec War and the conquest of Mexico, even at a fundamental level, we need to understand how the event has shaped history and how it has been shaped by history. Over the last 500 years, people have beaten this event to death, whether spewing lies about it or manipulating the very narrative itself for political gain, both of which have happened several times at a macro level. Let's take a look at a few examples. We like this background. I do. I know I keep doing this, and I'm sorry, but we here at the Awesome Time channel are full-time scholars breaking open barriers and peering into the past. Part-time gooners and government psyops on the side. I'll make this brief. What we need to know, and this should be at the front of your mind at all times, no, not me naked, you freak. Although if you do want to see that, go subscribe to my Patreon and I'll definitely make that happen. Good Lord, I'm bad at staying on track. Did I take my medication today? Feel less controlled by the 5G internet than usual. All right. What we need to be cognizant of at all times when discussing history is that any discussion of the past is fundamentally a discussion of the present. This is an inescapable reality. Got it? So it's cemented in your little brain noggin? Cool. So now let's discuss the ways that the conquest of Mexico has been molded, not only by history itself, but by people. To clarify, I will be discussing how the conquest of Mexico as a narrative and concept has been used and manipulated through time. Moreover, this video will be generally about how historical concepts are used and formed by biases and contexts. Alright, Let's begin with the first major reinterpretation of the conquest by the ruling Bourbon family of Spain in the 18th and 19th centuries. Since Spain had gained what we will call control of the massive chunk of North America they called New Spain, they were presented with a unique problem. They, meaning Spanish higher-ups and more or less just the king, suddenly had a massive population under their wing and influence, that population only increasing with time and quickly. To make matters more complicated somehow, this population was an ocean away. Governors and officials, both judicial and religious, were tasked with guarding this disconnected control while remaining loyal to and protecting the interests of the Spanish crown. Of course, those officials were difficult to control as well. You couldn't exactly make someone's phone explode in their pocket from 1,000 miles away just yet.
I decided we're holding the microphone now. In this far-off land where Spain, kinda out of nowhere, suddenly had control over, the narrative of the Cortez expedition was very popular. Over time, it took on a particular role in Novo-Hispanic and Spanish culture, one of justification. In many ways, the narrative of the Spanish-Aztec War, more specifically the letters from Cortez, were justification for the war itself. Like I've mentioned, Cortez was never supposed to go on an expedition into the interior of Mexico. He was just supposed to scout the coast and possibly set up a port. The illegality of his expedition required him to suck up to the king, send some treasure back to Spain, and play the religion card, in order to defend his actions. He was sending letters to cover his ass while he was on his way to and inside of Tenochtitlan. Every conflict ever has needed some sort of justification. You usually can't just round up a bunch of guys willing to kill anything that moves without first explaining to them a reason for decapitating a child with a garden hoe. If we are to view the conquest of Mexico as more than just the fall of Tenochtitlan, instead as an ideological, cultural, and political effort to subjugate a massive population that continues to this day, then it makes sense to say that this conquest needs and has always needed some justification. I'm getting really tired of saying the word justification, but none of the other synonyms really worked for me. So initially, the Spanish-Aztec War, which has historically been discussed far more than the subsequent conquest, was seen and depicted as almost storybook-esque. Influenced by the letters from Cortez to King Charles, the expedition and war were seen through a combination of moral and ideological lenses. The purpose of the expedition and war was to, according to the narrative, stop the barbaric act of human sacrifice and to free the subjects of the brutal and monstrous Aztecs, and also spread some Jesus along the way, of course. For about 2.5 centuries after the fall of the Aztec capital, the narrative of a righteous, ideologically driven effort taken upon by a virtuous captain and his soldiers to save those under Aztec rule was spread widely. Moreover, an important aspect of the narrative was the propping up of the Spaniards. As the story went, the Spanish victory in the war was the result of the toughness and the grit of the small and ill-equipped Spanish force, as well as the cleverness of their leader, Hernando Cortez. We're going to call this Holy Warrior Cortez. This against all odds victory to those who told the narrative in the 16th and 17th centuries was proof that the Spaniards were the embodiment of heaven's advance into the wild, unknown world of the American idolatrous pagans, thus justifying it morally. Hernando Cortez was bolstered as a prime example of Spanish fortitude and moral character. This heroic narrative, which of course leaves out many important aspects, including the mention of the thousands of indigenous allies that were the real reason that the Spanish beat the Aztec, was reinforced and told repeatedly. A story created by Cortez and later Castillo in his publication became the accepted history. Cortez was spoken of as a premier champion of the Spanish crown and Catholic Church, who had brought such large swaths of land under the crown's rule and massive populations under the jurisdiction of God. This version of the narrative played a massive role in the Spanish monarchy's justification for the subjugation of not just New Spain, but all of their other American territories at the time. It was useful when they were criticized for their treatment of indigenous peoples. In a 1647 defense of the Spanish Empire in America, an influential jurist named Juan de Solorzano ruled that the admittedly unjust and cruel actions of some of the more violent conquistadors was not a valid judgment of the Spanish colonial system. Rather, the pious and ideologically Christian Spanish leaders should instead be considered.
under the consequentialist viewpoint common among mass conversion promoters, of which Spain was a large influence. This view of mass conversions led Solorzano to the decision that the eventual and consequential benefit of mass conversions far outweighed the harm done by the less genteel Spaniards in the short term. To Solorzano, Cortés himself and his just actions were the beginning of the Spanish Empire, as his daring and brave mentality allowed millions to be brought under Spanish religion and politics, which was seen as a massive benefit to the indigenous peoples and Spain itself. This decision was substantiated massively by Solorzano's understanding and acceptance of the widespread heroic narrative of the Spanish-Aztec War and conquest. The Spanish crown continued to promote this heroic interpretation into the 18th century. Writings at the time spoke of Cortés's expedition as an arranged mission from God himself to drive out and convert those under the devil's influence. To those who took a more religious view, it made sense that a small, ill-equipped band of Spaniards only succeeded against such a powerful empire because of God's influence. How else could you explain the heroic actions of Cortés and the stupidity and cowardice of Montezuma? Surely it was God sending in his heavenly soldiers to drive out the idolatrous devil worshippers from American soil. I'm gonna have a count how many times they say massive. This trend and interpretation remained popular until around the 1740s, when the Spanish crown was taken over by the House of Bourbon, who instigated what is called the Bourbon Reforms. During these reforms, the conquest took on a much more secular view, secular being attitudes and things not connected to religion. In secularization, the conquest was painted less as a war between good Christians and pagans, and more as a war of ignorance against reason. This is pretty understandable for the time. Secularization was a large part of Renaissance and Enlightenment ideologies, part of their whole personal freedom kick. The conquest was also pushed as a platform for the spread of science and politics and logical ways of life experienced by Europeans. Of course, indigenous societies, especially those like the Aztec, were incredibly advanced technologically and scientifically, made especially impressive by their lack of access to domesticatable animals and advanced metallurgy. But since it wasn't the European style, it needed to go. That will forever piss me off. Oh my god. The more enlightened version of the conquest, and more specifically the Spanish-Aztec War, features a Cortés and conquistador army less of a force of God's will and agent of the Spanish crown, and more features Cortés as a philanthropist, wanting to spread the blessings of European progress and technology. We'll call this Cool Guy Cortés, since he just wanted to help the poor, helpless natives like you would help an abused dog at the pound. Adopt, don't shop. Don't breed and buy while shelter animals die. Talking to all you golden doodle owners, your dog is misbehaved and smells really bad. Yes, I'm generalizing. I don't really care. There's so many pit bulls that need your help. Please go adopt one. Something interesting about the Cool Guy Cortés narrative is it gave a new sense of agency to the Aztec and Nahua people. Instead of depicting them and Mexico as being merely defeated, they were shown as also being victorious by losing, because of all the good brought by the Spaniards. Novo-Hispanic poet Francisco Ruiz de Leon wrote an epic version of the conquest for King Fernando VI, where despite the brave and tough resistance from the natives, their defeat was ultimately beneficial as they were brought under the blessings of, quote, high civilization and the, quote, one true faith. What I've liked about researching the many narratives and interpretations regarding the conquest is just how consequential these stories are. Non-historians, that is, happy people, probably see history as just stories, which is obviously and inherently true, but what is so interesting is that slight changes in these histories can have massive impacts during their contemporary times. The conquest is a great example of this. The ways that the story has been told and interpreted haven't just given fire to the wannabe playwrights and racist Instagram commenters across the centuries. It has also dictated the handling of important legislation, namely in the treatment and integration of indigenous Americans in New Spain, which seems like a pretty poor way to handle something like that, but I don't know, what can I say? Actually, no, I can say I wouldn't do that. The Bourbon secularized version of the conquest narrative was popular and important in the mid-1700s, especially regarding the question of whether to and how to reform the many cultures encompassing New Spain. This was business as usual, but by now they had a problem. They weren't the only powerful European nation in the Americas anymore, and they were at risk of losing foothold at all times. Oh, it's raining outside. Yay! A chosen method of cementing their hold on their territory was to ramp up their economic productivity. One issue: those damn natives were lazy and incompetent workers, at least according to the Spaniards. Another issue: those supposedly unreliable workers were the indispensable labor force in Spanish America, and for Christ's sake, they weren't even using their lands for useful industry like they should. They were just building towns and constructing temples. How dare they? The problem wasn't so much idolatry as it had once been. That had been the issue to Spaniards for quite some time, but with the Bourbon reforms, the view switched from the natives being inefficient and unreliable from their worship of false idols to more blaming their natural rustica and rudeza, or their rusticity and uncouthness. These people were naturally inferior in their state of being. This played into the increasingly popular mindset that the Americas were simply a degraded and fundamentally wild land, and thus its people would be so too. As Peter B. Vallea said in his writings in The Conquest of Mexico, 500 Years of Reinventions, quote, "Unreason and incivility were simply the human expressions of America's natural savagery, and what oases of refinement that did exist in the colonies depended entirely on consistent intervention by the Spanish crown. Left to their own devices, such rustic folks would be doomed to stagnate unproductively in ignorance, superstition, and deprivation, thereby preventing Spain from keeping pace with the other great powers." According to the prominent Jesuit and Vicar General of the Archdiocese of Mexico, Francisco Xavier Gomez de Cervantes, Spanish power provided the vital breath of political energy to all the inhabitants of Mexico. Without Spain, he warned in 1745, all civilized life in Mexico would quickly collapse into violent barbarism and oppressive tyranny. Unquote. Spain was essentially now viewing itself as the caretaker of a naturally savage people, and without their help, they would fall back into their idolatrous and wild ways, and that's terrible for the economy. Here's a big change. Unlike before, where the Spanish-Aztec War was depicted as the historic, glorious conquest where Spain and civilization triumphed over savagery, it was now viewed as an incomplete and ongoing process. Cortés merely planted the philanthropic seed. The rest of the work to convert and utilize these naturally wild people and lands still needed to be completed. Shout out Yerba Mate again. I don't know what this Yerba Madre thing is, but it's still good. Yet the Bourbon outlook was a little despondent. Quote, "To remember the conquistadors as philanthropists concerned with the material welfare of the Indians reinvented the conquest as a sort of Spanish white man's burden, as a selfless attempt to spread material and cultural prosperity to immiserated peoples. Yet these same peoples had a natural constitution that resisted such blessings. The conquest, in other words, not only was incomplete, but could never be fully realized. It was a sober and weary sort of imperialist self-justification, in which crown agents thanklessly shouldered the unending moral obligation to protect America from itself." Unquote. From here, the common consensus seems to split. Through the standpoint of the conquest being an incomplete philanthropic effort, those who took upon themselves to finish the job began to discuss ways to educate Native people in order to solve the problem of their innate laziness and unproductivity. In the debates that ensued regarding Native education, the conquest narrative was brought up frequently, with voices from various different communities participating, including the regular and secular clergy, viceregal administration, and indigenous towns. The other side of the debate saw the education of Native people to finish the initial conquest effort as a worthless endeavor, as any time spent wouldn't be able to overcome the Native people's natural wildness and disagreeability. I don't know what the hell their problem was, man. To the Bourbon doomers, too, the conquest was an unfinished endeavor at best and a well-intentioned failure at worst. This position rejected the triumphant narrative that had been the norm for some time in favor of a more pessimistic view, as the Native people, despite the great efforts put forward by the clergy and government of New Spain, remained rustic and poor, characteristics that any conquest effort could not overcome. This overall pessimistic viewpoint remained common and frequent for a long while, bringing us to the colonial Spanish in the early 19th century, at the dawn of their largest existential crisis yet, the unimaginable Mexican independence. For the revolutionaries, the conquest narrative would shift yet again. The incompleteness of the conquest would come front and center in this time. To Spanish higher-ups, Mexican independence not only represented the loss of an extremely valuable colony, but also was the very antithesis of Cortez's efforts, a complete reversal of the conquest itself. This idea was spread among the Spanish and loyalist populations through media like newspapers and periodicals. In order to attack Mexican nationalism and separatists directly, Spain again reiterated the idea that the conquest was a philanthropic effort by Spain to save America from its wild nature, and the only thing preventing Mexico from returning to its former state was Spanish rule.
You needn't take it any further, son. You've proved to me that all this ultra-violence and killing is wrong and terribly wrong.
In 1810, priest Jose Mariano Lopez y Torres called for gratitude toward Spain for saving Mexico from its lamentable state it was stuck in, listing atrocities committed by native leaders, comparing them to, quote, the happiness and joy brought by Spanish leaders, religion, and civilization. The royalist clergyman and scholar Jose Mariano Beristain de Souza, in his own media from the era, portrayed the conquest as being the introduction of civilization and grace to these savage American lands. To him, his hometown of Mexico City was a place of science, beauty, and reason, all thanks to Spanish benevolence and kindness. Nationalism and Mexican independence threatened to upend all of that. Nationalism was nothing less than America's natural barbarity sprouting back up, attempting to reassert itself, overturning 300 years of progress. Mexican revolutionaries had their own uses for the conquest narrative as well. Instead of viewing the conquest as a remedy to native wildness that needed to be maintained, they spread the idea that it was a mutually beneficial union between native nations and Europe. To them, the conquest was actually a success, not only thanks to Spanish civilization, but also equally due to indigenous, generally Aztec, technology, philosophy, and sophistication, said sophistication allowing them to embrace European ideas and technology. This union concept called for more respect toward indigenous people and ideologies, as well as more royal support for these historically ignored and suppressed people, which would allow for greater regional autonomy in New Spain. The main goal here was to elevate America to equal political and societal status as Europe. This concept of native Mexicans swiftly taking on Spanish ideas was not new. But prior to the 18th and 19th centuries, it was seen more as a sort of come-to-Jesus religious epiphany in native populations when they did agree with European ideas. After the violence of the Spanish-Aztec War and subsequent wars with indigenous Mexicans, Spain embarked on a sort of, quote, spiritual conquest with inquisitions, religious conversion, all that. The embrace of Christianity by indigenous peoples in Mexico is really complicated and largely subjective. Everyone had their own reasons for doing so, though most of it was certainly violent. But it goes to show that native Mexican and European unionizing was not a new concept, but was being reinvented on the eve of Mexican independence. Quote, in contrast to the royalists and others who feared the survival of America's innate savagery beneath a shallow colonial gloss, advocates of the spiritual conquest emphasized transformation, purification, and redemption. Writing in the 1530s, the Franciscan evangelizer Toribio de Benavente Motolinia described mass conversions in which the entire population of Mexico, awakening to their religious errors, had fully embraced the church and its gospel and had thus already forgotten their ideals as completely as if 100 years had passed. Bro's on nuclear level copium there. To 16th century Franciscans, who, if you don't know, were the main Christian sect of Spain and thus their New World territories, the violence of Cortez's war and other battles after that fought to subjugate the natives were indeed lamentable. The wars, plagues, traumas experienced were a necessary cleansing evil. Some believe they were sent by God himself to give the land to the Spaniards and to punish the natives for their horrendous crimes and idolatry. But the fact that the native populations had survived and embraced Christianity so well was evidence enough to Franciscans of their moral strength and intellectual fortitude. The death was merely a method of freeing natives of their idolatrous ways. Yet, Fast forwarding to the eve of Mexican independence, Bourbon era thinkers saw the conquest not as a victory of civilization over barbarism, nor as an attempt to lift natives out of their idolatry, but saw it as a mutual and opportune union between two sophisticated and powerful nations, which led to the creation of a highly reasonable, scientific, and intellectual nation rivaling anything in the Old World. This optimistic view painted a much better picture of pre-conquest Mesoamerica, lauding them for their achievements of science and engineering and thought. This was clearly influenced by earlier Creoles and native leaders who wrote manuscripts detailing Aztec and other Mesoamerican societies and their accomplishments, which had been maintained by Jesuit and Franciscan friars who compiled them into larger compilations detailing indigenous society and culture, like what Bernardino de Sahagún had done with the Florentine Codex. This had been going on for some time, and thus by the early 19th century, indigenous thought and history still had influence over New Spain, Creole tradition admiring the Aztec for their achievements. But this admiration of pre-conquest indigenous culture made it really difficult to assess the conquest itself and the influence of previous native culture spread. Writings of so-called Indian conquistadors emphasized the, at the time, less accepted idea of indigenous participation in the toppling of the Aztec Empire. These writings were central in the effort for more indigenous political representation, attempting to strip the view of their barbarity and emphasize their pre- and post-conquest sophistication. This idea was also spread largely by native caciques or leaders. New Spain was, to this new interpretation, powerful and sophisticated because of its mixed roots, not in defiance or exploitation of it. To some, the fact that some native people had taken on Christianity so well was due to their inherent predisposition to do so, as in they were somehow geared to instantly convert as soon as any Christian influence arrived. This is weird. Here's an example. This went so far as one sermon occasionally given preached that St. Thomas the Apostle had actually reached America far before any European, seen to the natives as the deity Quetzalcoatl, which is just blech. It's basically 19th century pseudoscience crap. On to Mexican independence, coming up on 1800, Bourbon attempts to centralize power caused rising tensions between Spain and the colonial elite in New Spain. Here we see the conquest narrative seen much more negatively toward the Spanish, often emphasizing Spain's role in severing indigenous peoples' ability to conduct reason and their traditional way of life. The conquest, to the more revolutionary-minded, should have brought these two great nations together, but conquistador greed had instead brought violence. Corrupt magistrates had broken their native culture, making unification simply impossible. So negatively, Spain was being viewed by the colonial elite that they even thought to limit native people's exposure to the conquest narrative as to not anger or sadden them, which is really weird and pretty uncool. Their take was severely negative, yet didn't outright condemn the conquest. What we see on the eve of the revolution in Mexico is the colonial elites separating themselves from Spain by invoking the bloody history of New Spain itself, putting blame for the loss of indigenous life and culture squarely on the conquistadors and religious leaders of the 16th century and onward. Their reluctance to outright talk down upon and condemn the conquest itself tells us that perhaps they fear their position would be jeopardized through such a mindset spreading, maybe fearing the masses would view their position as also stemming from the violence of the conquest, which would have possibly negative ramifications. This period is pretty difficult to understand, as the accepted narrative had changed so often and so quickly since the Bourbon reforms began. It went from the conquest being a simple good over evil approach to a humanitarian effort by the conquistadors to bring the native people out of their devilish ways, to a split where the philanthropic narrative was either incomplete but continuing, or incomplete and a total failure, one impossible to reconcile. Leading to Mexican independence, the story and use of the conquest shifts into another split, where Creole and Cacique indigenous leaders tell of the glorious unification of two powerful and sophisticated nations, Spanish sympathizers and religious leaders saying the same, but the colonial elite meanwhile were attempting to drift away from their European overlord by telling of the violence and destruction brought by Spaniards during and after the conquest, while not outright criticizing it, still speaking on the conquest as a form of justice that was ultimately beneficial. This is very confusing, but it is a prime example of how narratives of national history and events can be used to sway public opinion and create massive change. Why don't we get into the woods with some potential methodology and a good example of this? I feel like this video is a complete mess, but I don't know, maybe with the power of editing in Photoshop, perhaps I'll make it okay. Creating myth history is a vital aspect of nation building, which requires vast amounts of political and social unification to succeed at all. Every population that has banded together to identify themselves under a banner has created a cultural history, whether accurate or not, to tie themselves to. In 1884, a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson, a large advocate for Native American rights, especially at the time, wrote her most pivotal work. It was a book called Ramona. If you're from California, especially SoCal, you've probably heard of it. Ramona is set in Southern California after the Mexican-American War, as the US was making their way into their newly annexed territory. The main character, a Scottish Native American woman named, believe it or not, Ramona, falls in love with an indigenous man from a mission named Alessandro, and they later elope. They travel across SoCal, have a daughter, and try to find a place to settle down. Alessandro's tribe was driven off of their land, and they finally moved to the San Bernardino Mountains. Because of their trials and frequent relocations, Alessandro starts to go a bit mental, especially after his and Ramona's daughter dies after an American doctor refuses to travel out and treat her. They have another daughter, who they name Ramona, not sure where they got that name from. Because of Alessandro's poor mental state, he goes on a bit of a psychotic break and steals an American man's horse. Despite knowing of his current mental distress, the American still hunts down and kills Alessandro. Ramona and Ramona 2 move back to a mission where Ramona 1 marries a man she was set up with in the beginning of the story due to his more pure ancestry that is not native. For Helen Jackson, this book was a last-ditch effort to spread her message. Before this, she wrote a non-fiction book about Native American injustices called A Century of Dishonor, which was not as popular as she had hoped. And by writing Ramona, she hoped to display these injustices in a more relatable way to get people to care about these very real themes of Native American mistreatment. So, how did it go? Well, Ramona was a hit. It was insanely popular, over 15,000 copies sold almost right after its publication in 1884 until Jackson's death in 1885. It was called one of the most important books of the century with novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin, and 6 years later it had sold over 600,000 copies. That is pretty insane for the time. Since then, there have been over 300 new distributions, and it is still in print today. That's great and all, but did her message get across? What do you think? Of course it didn't. One of the central aspects of Ramona's character is that she was half native, but readers generally ignored that. Her description as a black-haired woman with blue eyes was taken on, but I should say the readers of more racist affliction didn't see the common native stereotype in this character. So no, Ramona did not get Jackson's message across, much to her chagrin in the last year of her life. It actually had the opposite effect. Instead of spreading ideas and empathy toward the plight of Native Americans, it popularized the romantic concept of California life. A California, for those who don't know, were the more wealthy class of Spanish colonial California, and they were pretty much all pompous prigs. The California lifestyle popularized by Ramona was probably what you think of when you think of California missions. Colorful adobe buildings, music, dancing, romance, Jesus, you know. None of that is necessarily true, as you can probably assume, and this view of a romanticized version of Spanish history slowly became the cultural identity of Southern California. I mean, think about it. It's everywhere. How buildings are constructed, Hotel California by the Eagles, this Taco Bell, even the bag of flour tortillas I have in my kitchen right now, Mission brand, is influenced by this history. Of course, it isn't all due to Ramona. The El Camino Road that linked all the mission sites across California also made them a pretty popular tourist attraction, among other reasons. Santa Barbara's mascot is the Gaucho. A middle school near my house's mascot was the Dons, although they changed it to the Mustangs recently. Historically, Southern California has clung much harder to their Hispanic history, whether Spain or Mexico, which makes sense. They were in closer proximity to New Spain and Mexico City compared to Northern California, so there was far more influence. The Ramona story even has a yearly theater performance that is attended by hundreds, but Ramona didn't just affect SoCal. In 1928, an American movie adapting the Ramona story came out and was also very popular. American viewers, also unsurprisingly, didn't catch Jackson's message and instead took hold of a different message. They didn't fall for the mission and Hispanic romanticism, but their favorite part of the story was the American takeover of California after the Mexican-American War, which was a large theme. Americans saw the story as a history of the Americans kicking out the Hispanics and Native Americans, and as we all know, Americans really like stories that make us look cool. Northern California enjoyed the story as instead of taking on the romantic history of missions and presidios, they, like I said, liked the drama and cultural affirmation. NorCal has always associated itself with the Pioneer, which is a whole other can of worms. The Golden State name, the 49ers and their mascot Sourdough Sam, aligning themselves with the up-by-their-bootstraps hardworking conqueror of nature Pioneer, while SoCal associated themselves largely with the romance of mission and presidio life. Of course, there's nothing wrong with these cultural identities, it is an important part of being human, but what it reveals is how people and regions create myth histories to identify themselves with. To me, there's 3 C's of historical reinventions and myths: conquest, comfort, and control. Like Ramona and the Pioneer, the Spanish-Aztec War was a crucial aspect of the cultural myth history of New Spain and Mexico. These myth histories are ever-changing and often reflect what state a society is in, as we saw in how the concept of the conquest itself and the Spanish-Aztec War was used in creating revolutionary fervor in Mexico. Myth histories shape cultural and societal identities and can be easily manipulated to create massive change. But they can also be adopted to create unity, like that in the Mexican War of Independence or Northern California with the Pioneer. The creation of these narratives and concepts brings people together, gives them something to latch onto, and bringing people together is the most important part of maintaining control and cementing the role and influence of governments and nation-states over a given place. Comfort. The concept of the conquest has been manipulated and maintained by creating myth history narratives that serve those in power who are fed by the stories and attitudes spread among those at the bottom, their relations influencing how those at the top change the narrative, which goes back down, back up, over and over again. What those running the conquest of indigenous Mexicans understood is the integral importance of the narrative of the Spanish-Aztec War: control. Their entire system of converting the natives and maintaining control relied upon the contemporarily accepted narrative of how they gained an initial foothold in the conflict. The attitudes would change, thus changing the narrative of the war, the changes to the story then influencing institutions and operations in Mexico, which then over time changed the attitudes toward the operations, then the narrative, then the operations, on and on and on for over 500 years now. Conquest. The relationships of those everywhere on both sides of the Atlantic were and are reciprocal and predominant in their own ways, but have combined to make the most mind-numbing narrative, history, and script I have ever written. These themes have functioned from the start and have continued to function even to this day. Why am I moving a weird antique birdcage? I live with old people, so we just have things like that. No one can tell us we're wrong. Such in our hearts for so long. Both of us knowing love is a battlefield. Got a Pat Benatar vinyl the other day. That's pretty cool. In this next section, I'd like to commit a cardinal sin. As a history person, I will definitely get some flack for this, but it's important, I promise. Let's talk philosophy. Yeah, we're not going to do any of that sissy crap. This is a real history channel. Asshole. I hit my head really hard. This is Michel Foucault, a French historian and philosopher who was active from the 1960s to the 1980s. He is famous for his discussions of power dynamics, of which I'd like to discuss here. His ideas add a good shape to this video's concepts, in my opinion. In his book, A History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Foucault discusses a pretty neat interpretation of how power functions. This book focuses on the so-called sexual revolution that occurred in the 1960s during the Summer of Love, hippie stuff, you know. Essentially, Foucault argues that there was no awakening during this supposed revolution, merely a societal acceptance of what we were already doing for all of human history. He goes back to Victorian era and Enlightenment ideals that changed how we view sex and sexuality, making such subjects societally taboo, some of which continues to this day. Foucault was a gay man living in this time period, so I trust his insight here. He's just a really smart dude. He uses this topic to analyze how power works in society. I'm going to try my very best to explain this topic as an associate's degree level historian and YouTuber, Gooner on the side. Let's do this. So think for a second about what power is as a concept. It's pretty difficult to define. Leave your answer in the comments below. Don't do that. Actually, that made me want to blow my brains out. But also like, subscribe, and hit that bell. I'm gonna kill myself. The concept of power might make you think of stuff like a feudal monarchy, maybe an atomic bomb, perhaps my dominatrix bear Juan Pedro. He's from the Basque region. Those are understandable interpretations of power, especially the last one. Foucault tells us something completely different, however. To Foucault, power is not a static thing that any one person has. In reality, it is a fluid, dynamic entity that flows through every institution and individual through a method of exchange. Let's get into that because that made absolutely no sense. My original plan was to read directly from the book, and I even recorded it like 3 times, but the lighting was always so awful that I had to restart. And it also just made this video way too complicated and messy. I'm hoping this philosophical explanation will help round out this video and give you a good idea of the underpinning of a lot of these concepts and how they work. Like I said earlier, anytime that anyone brings up any historical fact, narrative, story, whatever, it forever changes that event through the filters of personal bias and cultural context, which is fed back into the web, its changes reverberating to everything in it, only to be changed yet again anytime anyone brings it up. It's a very productive concept. What Foucault attempts to do in his book is to replace the traditional view of power, that being the idea that power is top-down force imposed on those under the rule of whoever has it, like a king. What Foucault proposes instead is a distributed view of power. To him, power is not something that happens to people. It happens between them. Power is everywhere in society, and those we view as oppressed are in just as much of a position of power as those we traditionally think have it. I have to be totally honest here. I was having a very hard time constructing a valid explanation of this topic, so I looked for outside help, and this lovely individual on Reddit did a great job. So thank you, Autopoetic, for this. Here's what they say. Quote, "The standard way of illustrating this is the famous panopticon. For those who don't know, the panopticon is a philosophical concept originating from an 18th century English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, where a prison full of inmates is only run by one guard, but the prisoners do not know if they are being watched or not. The uncertainty of their observation makes them act obedient as if they were, whether they are or not." Autopoetic says, quote, "The prisoners isolated in their cells become part of the apparatus of power, monitoring themselves, internalizing the power relations in which they are embedded." Foucault writes, quote, "He who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection." And this is how his notion of power relations hooks into the body politics that he writes about so much. Power relations can become literally inscribed in our bodies. If the Catholic Church can convince you that pooping is immoral, they've taken something your body does and embedded it in a set of power relations between you and the priesthood, for example. In a sense, your body colludes in your oppression. That is the general form of power for Foucault. It comes from within you as much as it happens to you from without. It's the relation that is primary, which allows power to be this diffuse, distributed right in front of you but invisible thing. Thank you again, Autopoetic, really appreciate that. Like his ideas of power relations, historical narratives are crucial for creating identity and meaning in our everyday lives. These narratives and attitudes can be manipulated by those who have the means to bring about social change, like the friars and creoles in our last segment, who could spread new meanings of the conquest through their newspapers and other media. These changes of attitudes and meanings that come from the top then disseminate down to the everyday person, who then slowly and collectively with their fellow everyday people change historical events in the public consciousness. Societal reactions and interpretations of these newly manipulated events are then taken on by those at the top of the relation structure, where they can change it yet again based on how their society is handling the narrative, which then trickles back down and up and down, so on and so on. Kind of sounds like trickle-down economics. Fuck Reagan. Controlling history is controlling the present, and controlling the present means controlling the future. I'll read this from Foucault's book. Quote, relations of power are not in a position of exteriority with respect to other types of relationships, like economic processes, knowledge relationships, sexual relations, but are immanent in the latter, as in sexual relations. They are the immediate effects of the divisions, inequalities, and disequilibriums which occur in the latter, and conversely, they are the internal conditions of these differentiations. Relations of power are not in a superstructural position with merely a role of prohibition or accompaniment. They have a directly productive role wherever they come into play. Unquote. Our social relations are dictated by our culture, which is manipulated by those who run institutions and larger functions of society, and our reactions as a society to those manipulations dictates how those institutions further change and influence our relations to each other. A contemporary example that comes to mind is the large focus on sexuality. I don't know where I got that idea. Our social divisions on things like LGBTQIA+ rights are purely a societal construct. Our current strife has been manipulated over time by those who run our societies, compounding our division. Now institutions like Target sell their pride shirts every June to take advantage of this strife. You think they give a shit about your sexuality and self-expression? Hell no. They just see how divided we are on a non-existent, societally constructed concept and produce pride merchandise so those inclined to express themselves buy it, and those who are against it tweet about it. And they tweet about Target on Twitter, which is just free advertising for them. Maybe someone on Twitter will see that bigoted tweet and think they should go buy some Target Pride merchandise, and they do, further compounding the division, further bringing up Target's stock value. This is how these institutions take advantage of us. Social divisions are constructed by institutions who run our societies so that they can keep us focused on ourselves instead of anything they are doing to manipulate us and divide us further, while corporations take advantage of this division to sell you useless crap. This is not a new concept. This is how it has always worked. You think minorities and immigrants are the problem? Why don't you look at fucking Chevron? Pretend I'm Hitler. Actually, no, don't do that. But if I was a radical fascist attempting to take over a Western nation, it would probably be advantageous of me to sow social division by making my target population hate a certain group of people, while telling them that getting me in power is the only way to fix the problem. That might be kind of beside the point, but you get it. Wow, this might be my most boring video yet. I totally understand if you disagree with Foucault's ideas on this subject, as it is very personal and it's very instinctive for us, but I believe his explanation plays into the way I view historical narratives pretty perfectly. This is no different for our subject today. The conquest narrative has been changed and manipulated so many times in order to create a certain societal reaction, which then manipulates legislation that affects the population, which then garnered a new reaction. It is not just a conquest of native people, it is a conquest of the idea of native people and their culture and their history, and thus everything about them. The best way to get control over a certain group of people is to manipulate how a population sees them, and through that methodology, you can phase them out of existence. Nothing short of this has happened to the Aztec. Make no mistake, this culture is gone. Pre-conquest Mexican culture is lost to history. The conquest of history killed it. Through centuries of attempting to change their history and change the conquest of Mexico narrative, they have become buried under political manipulations and societal interpretations. That is why it is so difficult to know anything about them truly through a historian's point of view. You have to dig through centuries worth of political garbage to get anything tangible. This is why things like archaeological evidence have been so instrumental in our understanding of groups like the Aztec and the Nahua. Purely scientific methods allow us to really get a decent idea of what happened instead of just through stories written by Europeans 500 years ago. I'd first like to apologize for how long this video took, and also just, good lord, what a mess. It's been bad. I had just this idea in my head, but things got so complicated as soon as I read that stupid book, and it was just, I wanted to present so many ideas at the same time, and I'm glad that I edited it how I did, because it was way more of a mess before I changed up the whole section on Foucault. You have no idea. So, yeah, that's just me editorializing a little bit. Have I been repeating myself this entire video? I really have no idea. This has been a tremendously difficult concept to grasp for me, but the combination of Foucault's post-structuralist ideas, the story of Ramona, and the many reinventions of the Spanish-Aztec War narrative has brought it all into perspective for me in weird ways. This history is not simple, as it has imbued itself in pretty much every part of our lives. In many ways, the narrative of the war and conquest fits Foucault's definitions of power, as the story itself is power. It is part of everything, and everything is part of it. We will never know everything about the war or pre-contact Nahua culture. The conquest has made sure of it. It has worked for 5 centuries to manipulate the story, which manipulated the attitude toward it, which influenced the legislation, which affected the institutions, which changed the culture, which manipulated the story, and the cycle repeats for half a millennia until the history is completely unrecognizable to us today. Unfair? Yeah, of course. But understanding this facet of historical records and stories is the most important part of being a good historian. There is everything still to know, but you will never know everything. The conquest of history is never ending, and all we can do is try our best to use our best judgment, remain impartial, and utilize all aspects of science to better understand what we can. Those who view history partially, lazily at that, are dangerous and can hurt our understanding of not only the past, but everything we know now. We see everything through our past experiences, and that is no different with history from 500, 10,000, 100,000 years ago. Seeing life in black and white is a lot easier than living life analyzing different shades of gray. But it is through that exploration of grays, light, dark, and everything in between that we can unearth the essence and meaning of life that we all crave so much. To conclude, I'd like to recite a poem from Eduardo Galeano. From the branch of an old ceiba tree, hung by the ankles, swings the body of the last king of the Aztecs. Cortez has cut off his head. He had arrived in the world in a cradle surrounded by shields and spears, and these were the first sounds he heard. Your real home is elsewhere. You are promised to another land. Your proper place is the battlefield. Your task is to give the blood of your enemy to the sun to drink, and the body of your enemy to the earth to eat. 29 years ago, the soothsayers poured water over his head and pronounced the ritual words, "Where are you hiding, misfortune? In which limb do you conceal yourself? Away from this child." They called him Cuauhtémoc, eagle that falls. His father had extended the empire from sea to sea. When the prince took over the throne, the invaders had already come and conquered. Cuauhtémoc rose up and resisted. 4 years after the defeat of Tenochtitlan, the songs that call for the warrior's return still resound from the depths of the forest. Who now rocks his mutilated body? The wind or the ceiba tree? Isn't it the ceiba from its enormous crown? Does it not accept this broken branch as one more arm of the 1,000 that spring from its majestic trunk? Will red flowers sprout from it? Life goes on. Life and death go on.